I found a great question from Bo from Denmark. And his question was, what goes into determining collector car values? And that's kind of like asking how long is a piece of string. So I originally thought, well, probably not something I should bring up on the show. But then I scratched my head and I looked at it again. I'm like, no, this would be a great question to discuss on the show because there's a lot of different things that determine collector car values. So let's unpack them. And basically there's a macro level and then there's a micro level. So yes, this is going to be somewhat of an economic lesson. From the macro level, there are four big things. The first one is, was the car interesting when it was new? The second one is, how many of them were made when it was new? The third is there any competition history? Or like, did it win a lot of races, that kind of stuff, or who raced it? And then the fourth is, how many of them remain? So these are like the biggest things that determine collector car value. Now let me give you an example. Pretty much anything in the Ferrari 250 series, they check every single box, every one of those four boxes. So number one, it was interesting when it was new because it was a supercar when it was new. It was a 12-cylinder monster. It was a big car and a big engine, but it was a monster in like the late 50s. They made very few of them. And then for the third one, there was a lot of competition history. Like they did go to Le Mans and actually did quite well. And then fourth, there are very few available. Like, what did they make? 39 250 GTOs? That's why they're worth $15 to $25 million. So that's a really good example of checking every one of those boxes. So now, how would we unpack that on like a regular car, for example? Well, a Mustang is a wonderful example. So let's apply that same filter, the four questions, to Mustangs. So if you look at like a regular, let's call it a 65 Fastback. It was interesting when it was new. It definitely was because there was nothing else out on the market in that price range. So definitely check for an interesting when it was new. But then how many of them were made? A lot. So when something is as rare as glass, it's not going to be particularly valuable. So that's why you can easily, like I got a buddy of mine in Detroit. He just bought a coupe, a really nice one with a V8 for like $6,000. And then in terms of competition history, yes, the Mustang does check that box, but only the upper echelon cars like GT 350Rs, that kind of stuff. And then in terms of how many of them still exist, well, they're a Ford, which means they're reliable, so a lot of them are still on the road. Again, the reason why one can still buy one of these things for $6,000, $10,000, $15,000 and have a great car. But then another example is, do you guys remember we went to Bob Boniface this year? My favorite episode every single year is the car garden party we do with Bob and his father. And this year, Bob's father brought his own personal car from Ohio, which is a Lancia Aurelia B24 convertible. And Santa Maria Madre de Dios, one of the prettiest cars on the planet. And it checks almost every one of those boxes. It was interesting because there were so many things that were innovative from that time. It was like the first V6. The way the car is constructed is all the first. And a DD rear axle. There was so many things interesting about this car that made it a technological marvel. It was like the LaFerrari of its day. And that is why today it is interesting. And then let's go back into how many were made. Very few, because it was an incredibly expensive car, more expensive than a 300 SL. So very few of them were sold. There was some competition history, but not like a 300 SL. And then you get into how many of them exist today. Not that many, which is why they're worth $400,000 to $600,000, some crazy number like that. And I know what you're probably thinking. Well, if you look at, actually, and you guys should Google this, B24 Aurelia convertible, and then go like Google any one of the, like an Alfa Romeo 2600 convertible. That, granted, they're two different looking cars, but the general shape is the same, the look is the same, the design is very similar, but the 2600 is worth 50 grand. And the Lancia is worth 500 grand. And it's all because of how interesting when it was new and what was something, how many were actually built, competition history, and more specifically, how many exist today. So that's another great example. Now we need to like put that off to the side, and there are some like the micro pieces that affect collector car value as well. Like for example, something that's happening a lot right now is celebrity provenance. So over the past, I want to say 5-6 years, Gooding and RM, all these big auction companies that do all the fancy cars, they have been incredibly good at trotting out cars with celebrity provenance. For example, Steve McQueen. Like you'd swear there is a factory where they make ex-Steve McQueen cars. And what they've proven is it usually double or triples the value of that specific car. Now that's only in the case of Steve McQueen. There are some cars where it could be like I don't know, an actress like Rita Hayworth back in the day owned a specific car, and that might increase the value, but not as much as like a Steve McQueen. Like for example, there was a 250 Lusso that sold, let's call, I think it was 5, maybe 6 years ago. At the time, Lussos were doing $800,000 to maybe $1 million for the nicest one. The Lusso that was Steve McQueen's, which was brown, so it wasn't the typical Ferrari color. Actually, I thought it was beautiful. That one sold for $2.3 million, more than double what a run-of-the-mill Lusso was doing. Actually, one in really good condition. So that proved that there was some value to celebrity provenance. But don't look at this as a hard and fast rule. Like, what did they do? They tried to sell, it wasn't a big fancy car like that. I think it was like a Pontiac Bonneville convertible they tried to sell this year up at Monterey. And it wasn't, I want to say it was like a music star, but it didn't really even add any value to it. So it's not a hard and fast rule that the celebrity provenance makes sense there. And if you want to see more collector cars on the show, you know, start watching my old episodes with collector cars. And as those views go up, we will do more collector cars because I would love to drive more old cars.